Okay, so this is like day 5 at the yard. So on day 4, I was like, okay, I need to check the engine, make sure that it's going to start. So first thing I did was just to turn the key to see if the tank was full, and it wasn't full. And I was like, well, maybe I need to start it for the gauge to come on. And then the gauge didn't, nothing doing it, it stalled. So then I filled the tank. I was pretty sure I'd filled the tank, and so I had a couple theories, I guess. One that I didn't put a ton of weight on was that the fuel had leaked out of the tank over the course of the year and into the bilge, and then it was pumped out. And the reason why I didn't put much faith in that was because I was checking and bailing the bilge and inspecting it and smelling it, and it didn't have diesel in it. There was no diesel in it, right? I didn't do anything on the engine. I worked on the sails, and I also cleaned up that mess from the 5 liters of oil. But yesterday, I filled it up all the way to the top, put 26.5 gallons, which is a bit odd because the last gallon and a half I went to the gas station, so I put 25 gallons in, and that seemed like a little much to put in another gallon and a half, because the hoses I don't think have that much in it. But anyways, it was filled to overflowing. Then I went about my business. I got spare fuel, as I normally do, and ran errands with the last bit of the car rental, right, the 4-day car rental. And then at night, and I also bled the engine, right? So I before I did any more errands, I made sure I bled the engine, got it started, and it started, and the gauge was showing full. And so then I was like, okay, all good. I don't need to do major work on the engine right now. There's stuff I wanted to do. There were upgrades I wanted to do, but I didn't do it yet. And then I came back, had dinner, did some deck work, got everything secured on the deck. And then I look at the bottom in the bilge, and it's full of diesel, full of green diesel, right? The diesel is dyed green here that I just bought and just filled the engine with. And so I think by almost midnight, there was only like, we'd at least lost 5 gallons. I bailed out a 1.5 of pure diesel, no bilge water, just pure diesel. And I put it in one of my spare jerry cans. I have to ask where the diesel disposal is here before I can really bail out a bunch of it. And I could clearly, once I'd seen that, I could clearly see diesel trickling down from the back of the keel into the bilge, right? So obviously with that, we were going to haul out tomorrow, and they'd even put us almost in the cradle, although they hadn't taken us off our blocks yet. They'd taken off the hurricane blocks, but they hadn't taken us off our stands. And I had to email them and say we can't go because got diesel in the bilge. The tank is leaking, right? So I mean, I guess whatever we want to do, I think we would want to be hauled out until we got the tank problem fixed, right? So it's also questionable that we get to a marina or a boatyard before all the diesel fuel falls out. So right now I need to find where it is and see how it's possible to replace the tank. I got some theories. Maybe we could cut away the tank and replace it with something else that is a little bit smaller. Maybe we could remove the engine. They did that in New Caledonia. They lifted the engine, but that means you also have to. It's a fairly good job to do that, and you also need to get it aligned. And I really like the alignment of the engine right now, and I'm loath to do that, but that if that's the only way. And then I don't think you can cut through the deck and then put it back together. So I suspect either you go through one of the lazarettes and cut one of the wooden bulkheads there. They're like plywood bulkheads, and then remove it that way. You could cut it apart, I guess, and then put something smaller in its place. It's easier to maneuver. I mean, I guess my perspective is whatever is easiest, least risky at this point. I've kind of gone off from caring about range under power. As long as we have the range to get, to get into port right when we're close, then I think that's more than enough. So if we went down from a 25-gallon tank to a 15-gallon tank, that would not be the end of the world for me. As long as it's stable and it does what it needs to do, then that's fine, because I can just keep on filling it at sea, which is what I've been doing. So I just, effectively, like, going from the 25-gallon tank to a 15-gallon tank, for example, would be like, it wouldn't reduce the range by 40%, because the range is more determined by the number of jerry cans, which I typically have 5 jerry cans, but I was going to go down this season just because I think that was excessive. In the past, I've even had diesel bladders, and that was excessive and too messy. So, but we got to get this fixed before we go in the water, and so that's gonna possibly delay the season, possibly mean that we have to extend our cruising permit, which I do not want to do, but we will see. I think the other implication is that the leak is fairly large, and it's fairly fast, and the fact that the bilge was empty, right, of diesel when I got here in May. I left it in July the previous year. The yard was instructed to run the bilge pump once a month, right? Is that they pumped it, emptied sometime probably before March, and they pumped it all out through the bilge pump, which some of that got on the keel, right, which is where they, why they were alerted to the issue, because of the person that was pumping it out, they didn't smell diesel, they didn't look at diesel in the bilge or anything, and didn't notice when they pumped out that there was like a sheen of what they pumped out. But that was why it was, my first impression was that somebody pumped it out, but directly from the tank. But I think the more likely thing is that the tank failed sometime several months ago, and the minder, the boat minder, who was supposed to wipe down the boat and run the bilge pump once a month, he just didn't take note of what came out of the back of the boat and what was on the ground or what was in the bilge, and it was all pumped out onto the ground. All right, so I've been working, I guess we're on day 6 of me arriving here at the boatyard, and I've been working the last 2 days just exclusively on trying to get the tank out. So far not successful. I was able, after about a day, to move it. the last day I've been trying to get it further and further out into the lazarette. So the starboard lazarette, and then the idea is to get it in the starboard lazarette and then cut a big hole in the bulkhead, the plywood bulkhead that forms the quarter berth here. I'll show you the quarter berth right here. This is it's the master berth. This is the biggest berth. And in the back there's a big plywood bulkhead. You know, it's basically that Island Packet like made absolutely no thought to how someone would remove the fuel tank if it failed when they constructed the boat. So they constructed the boat all around it. They dropped it in, put the fiberglass top on, did not think about how somebody would remove it when it failed. So we're basically screwed. So I think I can get it out into the lazarette there. I think I read something that somebody did that on an Island Packet 31. But it's a tight squeeze, and so I need to get down to the last couple inches of the plywood bulkhead that's there. I need to cut that away so that I can get into the lazarette, so that I can cut the big hole in the quarter berth and remove the tank, and then I can get the tank repaired or replaced. You know, I mean, the only other alternative is just cut it up where it is. And, you know, the only reason I haven't done that yet is because I think it would be very difficult to do that, because you got to cut it all the way around. So I'm holding off on that for the moment, because I think it would be just too hard. But that's pretty much the other alternative. I guess in theory you could just leave the empty tank and then just put a tank someplace else instead of where it is right now. And you know, you could run off of a plastic tank. I guess you could run the diesel engine off of a plastic tank. You just put it in one of the lazarettes. I'm not planning on doing that, but I'm keeping all options open to get the engine working again and the tank not leaking. It was leaking about 3 liters per hour, you know, when I filled it that last time, after it had been laid up for 10 months. So it wasn't leaking before that, and then it leaked 3 liters per hour after the 10 months in Darwin, Australia. Okay, so I finally got the tank out. So it went through the starboard starboard locker, and then through the quarter berth, which is the main berth in the Island Packet 31. That's the SLOW BOAT. Contango is an Island Packet 31. As you can see on the bottom there at the point, there's multiple kind of white corrosion marks. And if you look really closely, you will see holes in them, right? So there's multiple holes. So I think what happened was the sediment just finally corroded through multiple holes. There's one really big hole here that's about 2 centimeters, and then or 2 millimeters. But the rest of them are mostly pinpricks, although there might be one that's maybe a millimeter across. You know, it's more like a constellation. There's maybe 3 dozen of these different pinpricks, and then some of these that are a bit bigger, right? So you can see the kind of white corroded parts, and then there's a black part. So that has several 1 millimeter ones. This is the 2 millimeter one, and that's so what we need to do is we need to repair the bottom of the tank, and then it should be good to go. I think the rest of the tank looks pretty good, given the vagaries of international shipping. I think I would just say, let's just repair this. So I'll talk to some welders and see how they would affect the repair. I we did look at one island packet, which was that had a tank that was repaired. They said they repaired it with epoxy. I can now see why they repaired it with epoxy, because the holes are relatively small. And there is aluminum epoxy you can buy at West Marine, for instance, if you're in the U.S. We might even have some of it, but I'm going to talk to welders first and see what they recommend. And it took me 3 days to get it out there, and it just like barely slid it out with what I could cut down. I actually would probably prefer if they cut the bottom out and then put in a new piece, but I don't know that they'll do that. Just because that would make it easier to slide it back in. Because, coming to that point down there, that's really difficult in the space that we have for where it lays in the middle of the boat. It doesn't seem that big or heavy for all the trouble it caused. It's too bad Island Packet made it so hard to get to. Didn't make any provision for people to take it out and repair it or clean it or anything like that. So that's definitely a flaw in their design. But now Contango has a clear route to take it out and clear it, because I'm going to be able to put it back in, and I've taken it out. So if we need to do anything to it again or replace it again, it should be a lot easier. But it did involve unattaching a lot of hoses, and there's also some autopilot stuff down there that I had to detach. So that's going to be a bit of a job to put it back into. But you know what? There's really no alternative to that, because the alternative is that you have a boat that doesn't use an engine anymore, and that really is going to increase the danger and risk of your sailing, and you have to be very convinced that you can go upwind effectively and efficiently in all circumstances. And I was not convinced of that. So I don't, I think that giving up on the engine would be basically the end of our trip. All right, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how to get it out of the Island Packet 31. We went through the starboard lazarette. That's the smaller lazarette, because the other one goes through the kitchen, and that there would be no easy way to cut it out, and you can't actually get it out of the lazarette directly. So you really need to go through the quarter berth. You can cover up the quarter berth with another piece of marine plywood, and that's what we did. Of course, there's a lot of wood that you have to take out. I had to saw off a lot of wood, and then I put in more marine plywood to replace it so that it had the same kind of covering. But I had to saw a lot off with jigsaws and reciprocating saws, and I had to get very, very close to the hull, but I couldn't get all the way to the hull because of the limits of the reciprocating and jigsaws. We didn't make any alterations to the float for the gauge, the fuel gauge. That seemed to work okay, although it kind of stays on full for a long time, which is a problem we had before we repaired it. We took an inch off the bottom, and that meant we also needed to take approximately an inch off the feed, because the feed goes all the way down, and you want to also cut a good triangle in those so it can suck the fuel. So there's the feed that goes down, which you cannot remove until you take the tank out, and then there's also the float for the gauge, which you can't remove until you take the tank out. All right, so we just had the tank repair. So the big change is like an inch was taken off the bottom. So this is the old thing. So maybe a little more than an inch. And it's about 6 inches wide here. So that's going to make it easier to get in. Clearly, from the bottom that was taken out, there was a lot of sediment. Seems like carbon. And I think, you know, kind of the issues that we may have had last year had less to do with the engine side, but maybe had more to do with the tank side. So, I mean, I think it's an old saw that people say you should clean out your tank. Yes, you should. But that's a question of, do you actually have access to clean it out? And we didn't actually have access to clean out the tank. So had to cut up the boat to clean out the tank and repair it this time. But my guess is that the intake line, which goes all the way down to the bottom of the tank, it was like it was clogged with the sediment. So it was like the sediment had like gathered around it, and so there was very little fuel it could actually take in because of the sediment. And so the kind of dying problem was probably due to not holes in the tank getting air bubbles, but rather to the intake line being buried in sediment, and it just can't get fuel. So it was getting starved for fuel, right? But it's possible air bubbles could have done that. When it finally failed, there's a point here in the middle. I think this is the bigger hole there. You can see that's that bigger hole, and I think that the key thing for that, there were many kind of pinprick holes, but they were so clogged with sediment, I don't think they were leaking that much. But that one, the sediment seemed to get unclogged there, and that was why it was leaking 3 liters per hour when I returned to the boat after a 10-month layup. So glad we got this fixed. Hopefully everything will go well. There's quite a lot to hook up now, but hopefully it'll be a bit easier to get it in than it was getting it out. Subscribe. Last minute, subscribe. We give you the stories of the most interesting sailors in the world and our round the world adventure.